Welcome to the 5th video in our series on traditional approaches to cost assignment. In this video, we continue to look at methods of inter-service department reallocations. Specifically, this video deals with the specified order of closing method. So what are our learning objectives for this video? As with our previous video, we will begin by revising the underlying workings of the departmental overhead rates. Once we have done this, we will continue with our example, this time using the specified order of closing method to allocate our service department overheads to the production departments. Remember that this is our process of how we calculated departmental overhead rates. In our previous video, we focused on steps 1 to 3, with the end result of having allocated our various overheads to the departments in the factory. In this video, we will again be focusing on steps 4 to 7, which look at the reallocation of service departments, the calculation of the departmental overhead rates, and the allocation to the products. Remember that there are 4 methods of reallocating our service departments to our production departments. In our previous video, we looked at the direct allocation method. In this video, we'll be focusing on the specified order of closing method. With the specified order of closing method, the first thing we need to do is determine the order in which the departments should be closed. The generally accepted method is to rank the departments in the order of how much work the service departments do for each other. We then close the department that does the highest amount of work for the other service departments first. Then the department that does the second highest amount of work for the other service departments gets closed second, and so forth. We also see that once a service department has been allocated out and closed off, we no longer make any return charges to that service department. Let us see how this works in an example. We are going to use the same example we have seen in our previous videos. So remember that we are in this factory that has 2 production departments, namely cutting and assembly, and 2 service departments, namely procurement and maintenance. We are then presented with our first table, which provides us with our overhead cost for the factory in total, while the second table provides us with some basic information about each department, which we used in our previous videos to allocate the overhead costs to the departments. We are then provided with the required where we need to value this product. Notice at the end, now it tells us that we need to apply the specified order of closing method, allocating out the procurement department first. Now remember that in video 3 of the series, we allocated out the overheads to the various departments. If you can't remember how we arrived at the numbers on screen, please go back and watch the video on allocating overheads to the departments. Our next step then is to allocate our service departments, which were procurement and maintenance, to our production departments of cutting and assembly. For the specified order of closing method, we need to allocate the overheads out in a specific order. Remember that the required told us that we must allocate the procurement department first. So in my table on screen, I have put down procurement first and maintenance second to represent this order. Remember now that we need to allocate out procurement based on the data that best represents its usage by the other departments. If you watched our video on the direct allocation method, you should remember that procurement relates to the purchasing of goods or services, and so we selected raw material orders as our means of allocation. So now we need to allocate procurement to the cutting, assembly, and maintenance departments. So 50 out of 100, being the total, will go to the cutting department. 35 out of the 100 raw material orders will go to the assembly department, and 15 out of 100 will go to the maintenance department. Notice how we have allocated the full 98,000 Rand to our cutting, assembly, and maintenance departments. Now if we add the 49,000 Rand, the 34,300 Rand, and the 14,700 Rand, we arrive back at the total procurement department of 98,000 Rand. Now note that the procurement department has been allocated out and has been closed off. When a department is closed, we never allocate back to that department. Also, notice that the overheads in the maintenance department are no longer just the initial amount of 70,500 Rand. We also have an extra allocation of 14,700 Rand, so the total overheads now in the maintenance department is 85,200 Rand, which now needs to be allocated out. Remember, in our previous video we determined that the maintenance hours was the best method to allocate out our maintenance department. However, remember that we have already closed off the procurement department, so we do not allocate back to the closed off department. Therefore, we ignore the 150 maintenance hours used by the procurement department. We are only interested in the 350 hours used by the cutting department and the 500 hours used by the assembly department. If we add these together, this gives us a total of 850 hours. So we need to allocate the overhead as 350 out of 850 to our cutting department and 500 out of 850 to our assembly department. Now for the maintenance department, notice that we have allocated out the original overheads of 70,500 plus the allocation from the procurement department of 14,700, which gives us a total of 85,200 Rand. Notice again that we do not allocate to the procurement department as it has already been closed off. So if we add the 35,082 Rand and the 50,118 Rand, we arrive back at our total overheads for the maintenance department of 85,200 Rand. If we then total our departments, we see that the cutting department has a total of 233,582 Rand, while the assembly department has a total of 364,418 Rand. Notice that both our service departments have zero overheads in them. We have thus allocated all our overheads to our production departments. Also notice that if we add the cutting overheads and the assembly overheads, we arrive at our total overheads of 598,000 Rand. Our next step now is to identify our driver for each production department. Remember from our previous video, we have already seen that cutting is labor intensive, and so we need to use direct labor hours, while assembly is capital intensive and we use machine hours. So we can fill in our cost drivers and divide our total overheads for each department by the cost driver for each department to arrive at our separate overhead rates for each department of 5.84 Rand per direct labor hour for the cutting department and 9.59 Rand per machine hour for the assembly department. So remember, our goal was to cost this product. Remember, our basic format is the direct material cost plus the direct labor cost to give us the prime cost. We then add our variable and fixed overheads to arrive at our total cost. In this example, we do not have variable overheads. Take a moment now to pause this video and see if you can calculate the product cost on your own. Now, our direct materials and direct labor are fairly straightforward, and you should remember them from our previous video on the direct allocation method. You should also remember that we calculated the total prime cost at 220 Rand. This will not change between the reallocation methods. So I will focus on the fixed overheads. When allocating the overheads to the product, it doesn't matter in which order we do this, so we will start with the cutting department. Remember that the cutting department is labor intensive, so we want to ignore the machine hours and only consider the labor hours of 5 direct labor hours. The 5 direct labor hours in the cutting department then need to be multiplied by the cutting department's overhead rate, which we calculated earlier at 5.84 Rand per direct labor hour. Notice we are matching the 5 direct labor hours used in the cutting department with the 5.84 Rand per direct labor hour for the cutting department. Because our overhead rate is labor hours, we are ignoring the machine hours completely. This gives us then our overhead allocation for cutting of R29.20 per unit. Now we move on to the assembly department. Remember, we determined that this department was capital intensive and the overhead allocation rate was per machine hour. Therefore, in the assembly department, we ignore our labor hours and are only concerned with our 7 machine hours. The 7 machine hours in the assembly department then need to be multiplied by the assembly department's overhead rate, which we calculated earlier at R9.59 per machine hour. Notice again that we are matching the 7 machine hours used in the assembly department with the R9.59 per machine hour for the assembly department only. Again, we ignore the assembly department's labor hours. This gives us our overhead allocation for the assembly department of R67.13 per unit. We can then finish off our example by adding the overhead costs to the prime costs to arrive at a total cost of R316.33 per unit. I hope you managed to get this on your own. Now, in the example we have just looked at, we were told the order in which the departments needed to be closed. If we were not told, how do we decide this? Remember what we discussed earlier. The generally accepted method is to rank the departments in the order of the service department which does the most work for the other service departments. This highest ranking department is then closed off first. Then, the department that does the second highest amount of work for the other service departments gets closed second, and so on and so on. So we need to calculate which service department does more work for the other service department. If we look at the procurement department, the raw material orders represents how much work it does for the other departments. We see here that 15 out of 100 raw materials relates to the maintenance department. This represents 15% of the work performed. We do the same for maintenance. The work the maintenance department does for the other departments is represented by maintenance hours. We see that the maintenance department does 150 hours for procurement out of its total of 1,000 hours. This represents 15%. Now we need to compare the percentage for each department to see which is higher, and we would close off the department with the highest percentage first. As we see, this generally accepted method is not particularly helpful in this example, as both departments sit at 15%. This is why the scenario told us the order in which the departments must be closed off. In our next video, we will look at how this example would have differed had we used the repeated distribution method. See you next time.